Good afternoon. My name is Anna Karras. I am a public services librarian with the Collier County Public Library, and I'm here to bring you part 4 of our Artitude series, where you become the armchair art historian and you learn a little bit about a famous painter and his or her lives and work. This week, we are talking about Oscar Claude Monet. And I bet you didn't know his first name was Oscar. Well, I didn't either until I started reading about him. So let's get a little bit into his life. Oscar Claude Monet was born November 14th, 1840 in Paris. He was called Oscar until he struck out on his own, so when he was a child and his family called him Oscar. When Monet was 5, his family moved to Le Havre in Normandy, and he was captivated by the estuaries and the nature all around him. He loved to sketch as a young boy and spent a lot of time outdoors doing just that. In 1851, he began his formal education, and he showed promise in drawing, which was no surprise, since he'd been doing it since he was 5. His family was firmly entrenched in the middle class, and his father was disappointed in Monet's flouting of the socially accepted careers. So when Monet was getting to the point where he was going to be studying for a career, he decided that he wanted to be an artist. His father was not happy with that. His father wanted him to do something much more acceptable and proper, like architect or doctor or lawyer. But he chose artist, which was not a sustainable way of living. So in school, he was drawing caricatures as a student of his teachers and local political figures, which you can see here. And some of them are not so flattering. In fact, most caricatures aren't very flattering, are they? Anyway, he actually caught the attention of a local painter named Eugène Louis Boudin, and he encouraged Monet to start painting. Boudin was a person who painted outdoors, which was revolutionary. But the idea was possible because of the invention of paint in metal tubes. So instead of having to be in a studio where you mixed your paints and had them there handy, paints came in now in collapsible metal tubes where you could take with you anywhere. And you could paint pretty much any place you wished, which, as I said before, was a revolution. Monet became obsessed with painting in nature, and he loved the immediacy of it. He loved being able to paint exactly what was in front of him instead of making sketches and taking them back to his studio and making paintings there. He loved doing it right there in the middle of the forest or the estuary or the garden or whatever. The artist as a young man. And here you can see a portrait in the middle of Monet before he grew his signature beard that was so evocative of him later in life. Just 28 years old in this picture. So when he was young, he saved his money from selling his caricatures, and he moved to Paris to begin his career as a painter, much to his father's dismay. His father was not pleased with his choice, obviously, but his aunt smoothed the way for him, helping him fund his move and acquiring letters of introduction into the art scene. So he moved in 1859, which is a year after this photograph was taken. So Monet studied drawing and painting until 1861, when he was drafted into the cavalry and was sent to Algeria. However, typhoid fever retired his career just after a year, and he was sent back to France to recuperate. After he became healthy again, he joined the respectable workshop of Charles Claude, a popular landscape painter. Other students of Claude included some familiar names such as Renoir, Sisley, and Bazille. These 4 became a painter's rat pack of sorts and went everywhere together. Their treatment of painting outdoors, en plein air, as it is called in French, was with broken color and rapid brushstrokes, which became the foundation for the later movement called Impressionism. And these 2 works of art I want to talk to you about. The first one on the left, Garden in Bloom from 1866, is a typical landscape painting. However, upon closer inspection, you can see that the brushstrokes are very broad. They aren't delineated. They are more of blobs of color as opposed to something carefully constructed. And that is the beginning of the Impressionist movement. On the right, Women in the Garden, also circa 1866. I put this painting in here because not only does it also have that impressionistic feel, especially in the grass and the trees. The four women I want to point out are all the same model, and we'll talk about her in a minute, but each one is the same woman, just posed in a different place. So take a look at that. You can see her face is only shown in one. In one she's turned away, one is hidden by a bouquet of flowers, and one is turned to the side. But they are all Camille Monet. She was an artist model, and she became a favorite of Monet's and quickly became his mistress. Their first child, Jean, was born in 1867, but because of their illicit relationship, meaning they were not married, his father did not approve. Monet abandoned Camille and Jean for a brief period of time because his father threatened to cut off his financial assistance. However, Monet finally did the right thing, returned to Camille, and married her in 1870. Their second son, Michel, was born in 1878, although Camille never fully recovered her health after the second birth, and sadly she died of cancer the following year at the age of only 32 years old. But let's talk about these two paintings. Woman in a Green Dress is circa 1866. In it, Camille is just 19 years old. This was painted expressly for the submission into the exhibition at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. This was the premier avenue for artists to receive notoriety and attention. It was accepted into the exhibition and sold for 800 francs, which was a very large sum of money for a struggling and relatively unknown artist. The second one on the right is Camille in a Japanese costume in 1876. In 1876, everything Japanese was the rage in France. It's like jazz being hugely popular in the 20s in the United States. So here we see Camille in a Japanese costume. She's wearing a blonde wig and she's holding a fan, and it is painted huge. It's a large, full-sized, full-length painting. And it was something that also was very popular and acceptable into the community of des Beaux-Arts. The Academy versus the Anonymous. So we've talked about the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and they are the quintessential way to gain notoriety and fame as a painter. But the Academy had very strict rules as to what painting should be. They were stodgy and sticklers for classical themes, with strict rules as to how paintings should look. For instance, religious themes, landscapes, and mythology were pretty much the only subjects that were allowed. And even within those particular genres, landscapes had to have a particular, like a building in the back, and some sort of body of water in it, and they were very strict as to how you had to set up your paintings. And the Rat Pack that I described to you earlier, Monet and his cohorts, they and others were fed up with the establishment's rules, and they decided to form their own exhibition in direct defiance to the Academy. So the anonymous exhibition had no jury panel and no honorary awards. All the proceeds, the admission, dues, etc., were split amongst the participants. Admission was 1 franc, and the first exhibition was in April of 1874, and it drew meager crowds, but the impact was long-lasting. So let's talk about the two paintings here. Jules Joseph Lefebvre from 1874 painted Female Slave with Plate of Fruit. And you can see here it was very delineated, very well posed, very classic in its structure and form. That was painted 2 years after Impression Sunrise by Claude Monet on the right. Impression Sunrise grabbed the attention of art critic Louis Leroy, and not in a necessarily good way. He wrote an article, Exposition of Impressionists, and coined the term Impressionism, actually. The article was hardly complimentary, but the name Impressionism has stuck and it has a completely different connotation today. After the meager success of this first exhibition, a second was created in April 1876, and Monet exhibited 18 works. The second exhibition received more critical and popular attention than the first, And Georges Maillard, an art critic, said the paintings were insanities of conception that are absolutely revolting. And you can see here two of the paintings that Monet had put into the second exhibition. The Luncheon and the Bathers at La Grenoire. And one of the things that were perhaps insanities of conception and absolutely revolting were that they were normal, everyday depictions of life. They were not exalted. They were not of religious themes. They were not of the gods and goddesses of mythology. They were not beautiful vistas of landscapes. They were just ordinary people doing ordinary things, and that was what got the art world so heated and upset. Now, Ernest and Alex Hoschedé were two people that were very important in Monet's life. Ernest was a wealthy department store owner and sometimes art critic, and became enamored of Monet's work. You can see his portrait on the left. He was the one who bought Impression Sunrise that we saw a couple of slides ago. In order to help out Monet financially, Hoschedé commissioned Monet to paint 4 murals at his chateau at Montgueron. So Monet goes to the country and stays at the chateau and possibly began an affair with Alice Hoschedé, who is pictured on the right, during his 6-month stay at their home. With Ernest in Paris, it is very possible. She gave birth to a son in 1878, just months before Camille gave birth to Monet's second son, Michel, and most likely both children are Monet's and half-brothers. Ernest Hoschedé loses his fortune in Chateau in 1878, and they move to the same small town as the Monets, a small hamlet called Vitoy, and the two families decide to combine fortunes and move in together, 12 people in one house. What an interesting situation that must have been. During this time, though, Monet produces 300 paintings as poor Camille sickens and finally dies. Ernest takes to spending most of his time in Paris, leaving Alice and Monet and their combined families together, which only strengthens their relationship. And finally, Ernest dies in Paris in 1891. Claude and Alice married in 1892, and they remained married until her death in 1911. More exhibitions. So Monet exhibited 29 pieces in both the third and fourth exhibitions of the Anonymous in 1877 and 1879, respectively. The group, Anonymous, formally agrees to adopt the name Impressionism, and the critics and press finally give them more unified respect. Attendance figures top 500 a day, which was huge. Unfortunately, the group is becoming increasingly ragtag and grumpy, and Monet almost bows out. In fact, he does not participate in the 5th exhibition, and by 1886 the group has largely disintegrated, but the independent Impressionist shows changed the course of art history. And let's take a look at these two paintings. The first is La Gare Saint-Lazare, which is a radically modern motif. It is of a train station. It is dirty and dusty and filled with smoke and coal and people going about their everyday business and trains, for God's sake. It's not something that is exalted and beautiful. But the changing effects of the light and the movements and the clouds of steam fascinated Monet. The second painting on the right, Le Rue Montorgueil in 1878, was painted after Monet had walked along the streets of Paris on their Fête Nationale. The excitement and movement are palpable in the image of the waving flags and the moving crowds. There are few works that better illustrate the dynamism of Impressionism, which is an art of movement as well as light and color. Monet did travel. In 1870, he flees to London to avoid the draft of the Franco-Prussian War, but he studies the works of John Constable and Joseph Mallord William Turner while he is there. In 1883, he went to the Italian Riviera and traveled with fellow painter Renoir and returned the following year by himself. The exotic landscapes he painted sold very well, and Monet earns over 50,000 francs a year for 3 years, which was quite impressive for a painter. In 1886, he traveled to Holland. He visited for the tulip season, and these paintings are as well hot commodities and make him quite a lot of money. And here finally you can see he traveled to Rouen in 1892. And what he did was he set himself up in a hotel across the street from the cathedral, and he painted from his window all day, changing canvases as the light progressed across the face of the cathedral. So you can see here all the different times of day, the shadow and light, and the way it played across the face of the architecture. Giverny. Many people are familiar with Giverny. It was the final home of Monet from the time he moved there in 1883 until his death. It is famous for its gardens, and it's famous for Monet's water lily paintings. Monet, Alice, and their children settle there in 1883, like I said, and Monet spends the rest of his life away from the art scene, painting out of doors and away from most people. He finally has enough financial success that he can purchase the home in 1890, and he begins constructing the water garden in 1893 and purchases the property next door to expand it. The water pond eventually covers 1,000 square meters, and the garden is several times that size. He paints from sun up to sundown, often parking in one location and switching out canvases as the light changes. The Japanese bridge is added at the turn of the century, and he is famous for painting that bridge over and over and over again. For 27 years, he will paint a cycle of water landscapes devoted to the theme of peace and contemplation. This garden is Monet's final haven, or maybe perhaps his only haven. Even during World War I, Monet refused to leave his garden. As a celebratory gift of the armistice, Monet offers 2 water lily panels to the nation. This gift grows into an entire suite of paintings to be housed in Paris in a special oval building at the Orangerie, which is near the Tuileries in the center of Paris. Unfortunately, Monet develops cataracts in his eyes, and they plague him, and he works intermittently until his death on December 5th, 1926. The rooms at the Orangerie were unveiled the next year, May 17th, 1927, and to this day it draws tens of thousands of visitors every year. And there is Claude Monet in his garden with the signature beard and the water lilies behind him. And he said once in a letter, "I follow nature, but I cannot catch her." I hope you have enjoyed this brief look at Monet and his life and work. Next week, we will be talking about another Impressionist painter, one who was maybe not quite so peaceful and contemplative. We will be discussing the volatile Vincent van Gogh. So please join me next week on Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and I will see you then, and take care of yourself. I'll see you on the other side.